The year was 1968, and the humid air of the Mekong Delta clung to everything like a second skin. Sergeant James Mitchell stood on the deck of a Navy patrol boat, scanning the dense jungle that lined both sides of the narrow waterway. He was 24 years old, a farm kid from Iowa who had volunteered for a second tour because he believed in the mission, and more importantly, in the men fighting beside him. The river moved slowly that afternoon, its murky brown water hiding everything beneath the surface. James had learned to read the jungle, to notice when the birds stopped singing, when the air felt too still. That day, every instinct he had was screaming that something was wrong. His unit was part of a joint operation, accompanying a group of South Vietnamese soldiers and American advisors deeper into enemy territory than they had been in months. The mission was supposed to be routine, a supply run to a remote outpost that had been cut off for weeks. But nothing in Vietnam was ever truly routine. James watched the tree line, his M16 rifle ready, sweat running down his back despite the breeze coming off the water. He had written a letter to his mother that morning, telling her about the farm he wanted to buy when he got home, about the girl he planned to marry. He had sealed it and tucked it into his pack, not knowing it would be months before anyone would find it. The ambush came without warning. One moment there was silence, broken only by the low rumble of the boat's engine, and the next, the jungle erupted in gunfire. James hit the deck as bullets tore through the air above him, the distinctive crack of AK-47s mixing with the deeper boom of a heavy machine gun. The boat's captain tried to maneuver away from the shore, but they were trapped in a narrow section of the river with nowhere to go. James could see muzzle flashes in the vegetation, dozens of them, maybe more. They were outnumbered and exposed, sitting ducks on the water. The South Vietnamese soldiers returned fire, but the enemy had the advantage of cover and position. Within seconds, 3 men were down, their blood mixing with the water that sloshed across the deck. James made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of staying behind cover, he grabbed the boat's mounted M60 machine gun and opened fire on the tree line, deliberately drawing enemy attention away from the wounded men. The gun bucked in his hands, hot brass casings flying everywhere, and he could feel the heat radiating from the barrel. Enemy fire concentrated on his position, rounds sparking off the metal around him, one grazing his shoulder and another tearing through his leg. He didn't stop. He kept firing, sweeping the gun back and forth, giving the others time to pull the wounded to safety and for the boat to gain distance. By the time they made it around a bend in the river and out of the kill zone, James had taken 4 bullets and probably saved a dozen lives. He collapsed as soon as they were clear, his uniform soaked red, consciousness fading as the medic worked frantically to stop the bleeding. James woke up 3 days later in a field hospital, his body wrapped in bandages and connected to tubes he didn't understand. The pain was intense, a constant burning that made it hard to think, but he was alive. A nurse told him he had been lucky, that the bullets had missed major arteries and organs by inches. His commanding officer visited later that day, a hard-faced colonel named Patterson who rarely showed emotion. Patterson sat beside the bed and told James that he was putting him in for the Medal of Honor, the highest recognition the military could give. He said that witnesses had described James's actions as the bravest thing they had ever seen, that his willingness to sacrifice himself had saved everyone else on that boat. James didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired and hurt and guilty that he hadn't been able to save the 3 men who died. Patterson told him that the recommendation would go through channels, that it would take time, but that James deserved it. Then he shook James's hand and left. The months that followed were a blur of recovery and paperwork. James was transferred to a hospital in Japan, then eventually to Walter Reed in Washington. His wounds healed slowly, the leg injury leaving him with a permanent limp, but the doctor said he had been extraordinarily fortunate. Mail from home helped pass the time, letters from his mother talking about the weather and the crops, notes from friends he had grown up with. The girl he had planned to marry wrote less frequently, and then not at all. He tried not to think about it too much. Other soldiers in the ward talked about their plans for when they got out, about starting businesses or going to college on the GI Bill. James mostly listened, not sure what his future looked like anymore. Then came the letter that changed everything. It arrived in early 1969, typed on official stationery from the Pentagon. James opened it expecting confirmation about the medal ceremony, a date and location where he would receive the recognition Patterson had promised. Instead, the letter was cold and brief. It stated that after careful review, the recommendation for the Medal of Honor had been declined. No detailed explanation was given, just a reference to irregularities in the operational report and questions about the circumstances of the engagement. James read it 3 times, trying to understand what it meant. Irregularities, questions. The words felt like accusations disguised as bureaucratic language. He had been told he was a hero, that his actions had been extraordinary, and now some desk officer in Washington was saying it didn't count. The confusion turned to anger, then to resignation. James tried to get more information, calling the numbers listed on the letter, writing letters to Patterson and others who had been there. Most went unanswered. Patterson finally replied months later with a brief note saying that the decision was out of his hands, that politics had gotten involved, and that he was sorry. Politics. The word stuck in James's mind like a splinter. What did politics have to do with what happened on that river? He had done his job, had saved lives, and now someone was erasing it from the record. The rejection of the medal felt personal, like a judgment not just on his actions, but on his worth as a soldier and a man. Other veterans he talked to had their own stories of bureaucracy and confusion, but none quite like his. Something about his case was different, and no one would tell him what. James was discharged from the Army in the spring of 1969 and returned to Iowa a different person than the one who had left. The farm his family worked looked smaller somehow, the fields stretching out in neat rows that seemed too orderly after the chaos of Vietnam. His parents welcomed him home with a celebration, inviting neighbors and friends who wanted to thank him for his service. He smiled and accepted their handshakes, but inside he felt hollow. He didn't talk about the medal that never came, didn't mention the letter from the Pentagon. What would he say? That he had been deemed unworthy? That his sacrifice had been questioned and found lacking? It was easier to let people assume he had come home without recognition, because that was just how things worked sometimes. He tried to settle into civilian life, taking a job at the local grain elevator and renting a small apartment in town. The work was physical and repetitive, loading trucks and managing inventory, and it helped keep his mind occupied. But at night, alone in his apartment, the questions returned. Why had his medal been rejected? What irregularities could possibly justify dismissing eyewitness accounts of what had happened? He considered hiring a lawyer, filing appeals, making noise until someone gave him answers. But he was tired, and the idea of fighting the entire military bureaucracy felt impossible, so he let it go, or tried to. The anger became a quiet resentment that he carried with him, a weight that never quite lifted. Years passed. James married a woman named Linda, a teacher at the local elementary school who was patient with his moods and nightmares. They bought a small house on the edge of town and had 2 children, a boy and a girl. He never told them much about Vietnam, just that he had served and come home. The war ended, and America seemed eager to forget it had ever happened. Veterans were largely ignored, sometimes scorned, and James learned to keep his service to himself. He attended a few reunions with men from his unit, awkward gatherings where they drank too much and tried to laugh about memories that still hurt. No one mentioned the medal, Some of them knew, he could tell by the way they looked at him, but they respected his silence. If you've been following along and finding this story interesting, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. There's so much more to uncover about forgotten heroes like James, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. The truth about why James's name was removed from that medal ceremony wouldn't emerge for another 15 years. In 1984, a journalist named Michael Stevens was researching a book about Vietnam War controversies and came across a reference to James's case in declassified documents. Stevens was a former Marine who had developed a reputation for investigating military cover-ups, and something about the brief mention caught his attention. He started digging, filing Freedom of Information Act requests, and interviewing people who had been involved in the chain of command. What he discovered was far more complex and disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The rejection of James's Medal of Honor hadn't been about his actions at all. It had been about protecting someone else. The story Michael Stevens uncovered began not on that river in Vietnam, but in a Pentagon office where decisions about valor awards were made. In 1968, the Medal of Honor recommendation process was heavily politicized, with senior officers and government officials often influencing who received recognition and who didn't. James's recommendation had reached the desk of a general named Robert Kincaid, a career officer with connections to powerful politicians and a reputation for managing the military's public image. Kincaid had served in World War II and Korea, earning his own medals and building a career on being the right kind of soldier, the kind that newspapers and politicians could point to as an example of American excellence. When Kincaid reviewed James's file, he saw a problem. The same operation that had resulted in James's heroic actions had also involved a significant tactical error by another officer, a lieutenant colonel named Douglas Freeman. Freeman was the son of a senator, a West Point graduate who was being groomed for higher command, and his decisions during the planning of that river mission had been questionable at best. The unit had been sent into an area known to be heavily occupied by enemy forces without adequate support or intelligence. The ambush that James had responded to so heroically had been entirely predictable, and several people in the chain of command had warned that the mission was too risky. Freeman had overruled those concerns, confident that his strategy would work. After the ambush, Freeman had written an operational report that downplayed the tactical failures and emphasized the success of the evacuation. He made it sound like a well-executed plan that had encountered unexpected resistance, rather than a poorly conceived operation that had nearly resulted in massacre. His report was polished and professional, the kind of document that looked good in a file and supported a narrative of competent leadership under difficult circumstances. But if James received the Medal of Honor, there would be scrutiny. Journalists would ask questions about why the situation had required such extraordinary heroism in the first place. Investigators might look into the planning and decision-making that had put those men in danger. Freeman's career would be threatened, and by extension, so would his father's political influence. General Kincaid made a calculated decision. He buried James's recommendation under layers of bureaucratic review, raising questions about documentation and witness reliability. He suggested that the action, while commendable, didn't quite meet the exceptionally high bar required for the Medal of Honor. He recommended a lesser award instead, something that would honor James without drawing attention to the circumstances. His suggestions carried weight, and other officers who might have pushed back understood the political implications. Freeman was protected, his operational report accepted without serious challenge, and his career continued on its trajectory. James became collateral damage in a system that prioritized institutional reputation and political connections over truth and recognition. Michael Stevens documented all of this in his book, published in 1985 with the title Valor Denied. He included interviews with people who had been involved in the decision, most speaking anonymously for fear of retaliation. He obtained copies of the internal memos that showed how Kincaid had manipulated the process, protecting Freeman at James's expense. The book created a modest stir when it came out, earning reviews in military publications and some mainstream newspapers. Veterans organizations took notice, and a few members of Congress asked questions about the case. But by then, Freeman had retired as a brigadier general, Kincaid had passed away, and the Pentagon showed little interest in revisiting old decisions. The official response was that the Medal of Honor process had been conducted according to regulations at the time, and that there was no basis for reconsideration. James learned about the book from a phone call. Michael Stevens tracked him down in Iowa and explained what he had discovered, asking if James would be willing to be interviewed for follow-up articles. James was 41 years old by then, working as a manager at the grain elevator, his children in high school. He listened to Stevens explain how his heroism had been deliberately suppressed to protect a senator's son, how the system had failed him not because of what he had done, but because of what acknowledging it would reveal. The anger he had buried for 16 years came flooding back, but it was mixed with something else now, vindication. He hadn't been crazy or paranoid. There had been a conspiracy, a real one, and now someone had exposed it. He agreed to the interview, and Stevens wrote a series of articles that appeared in military journals and got picked up by a few larger newspapers. James told his story publicly for the first time, describing the ambush, his actions, and the rejection letter that had never made sense. He talked about the years of wondering what he had done wrong, the shame he had felt at being deemed unworthy of recognition that his commanding officer had promised. Readers responded with outrage, sending letters to their representatives and demanding that the military review the case. Veterans groups rallied around James, making his story a symbol of how soldiers could be betrayed by the very institution they had served. The pressure worked to a degree. In 1987, the Army announced that it would conduct a formal review of James's case, examining the original recommendation and the decision-making process that had rejected it. James was cautiously optimistic, hoping that finally, after nearly 20 years, he might receive the recognition he deserved. The review took months, with investigators interviewing surviving witnesses and examining old records. But when the results came back, they were disappointing. The Army acknowledged that there had been irregularities in how the case was handled, and that political considerations may have influenced the outcome. However, they concluded that too much time had passed, and that the legal and procedural obstacles to awarding a Medal of Honor retroactively were too significant. Instead, they offered James the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration, as a form of compromise. James accepted the medal at a ceremony in Washington, attended by his family and some of the men who had been on that boat with him in 1968. It was an emotional day, filled with speeches about sacrifice and service, but it felt incomplete. The Distinguished Service Cross was a significant honor, but it wasn't what he had earned. It was a consolation prize, an acknowledgement that he had been wronged without a willingness to fully correct that wrong. Standing on the stage, shaking hands with generals and politicians, James felt a strange mix of pride and disappointment. He had waited 2 decades for this moment, and now that it was here, it felt hollow. The truth had been exposed, but justice remained elusive. The years after the ceremony brought a kind of peace to James's life, though not the closure he had hoped for. He returned to Iowa and continued working, watching his children graduate and start families of their own. The story of his denied Medal of Honor became part of his identity, something people knew about him, but it no longer consumed his thoughts the way it once had. He spoke occasionally at veterans' events, sharing his experience as a cautionary tale about how bureaucracy and politics could undermine even the most sacred military traditions. Younger veterans listened with a mixture of respect and disbelief, struggling to understand how the system could have treated one of its own so poorly. Douglas Freeman, the officer whose career had been protected at James's expense, lived a comfortable life after retiring from the military. He took a position with a defense contractor, earning a substantial salary and maintaining connections in Washington. He never publicly acknowledged his role in the operation that had nearly cost James his life, never admitted that his decisions had put those men in unnecessary danger. When Michael Stevens' book came out, Freeman issued a brief statement through a lawyer, saying that all his actions had been appropriate and professional and that he stood by his service record. He declined further comment, and the scandal never touched him in any meaningful way. His father, the senator, had passed away by then, taking with him whatever guilt or responsibility he might have felt. James tried not to think about Freeman too often, but it was hard not to feel the injustice of their parallel lives. One man had made mistakes and been protected, advancing through the ranks and enjoying the rewards of a successful military career. The other had done everything right and been punished for it, denied recognition to maintain a lie. The system had worked exactly as designed, protecting the powerful and expendable everyone else. James didn't become bitter exactly, but he developed a clear-eyed understanding of how institutions functioned. He taught his children to be skeptical of authority, to question official narratives, to stand up for what was right, even when it cost them. Those lessons came from hard experience. In the 1990s, as more Vietnam War records were declassified, additional details about James's case emerged. Documents showed that General Kincaid had not only blocked James's Medal of Honor, but had actively worked to minimize the recognition of several other soldiers whose stories might have raised uncomfortable questions. There was a pattern of protecting officers with political connections while denying awards to enlisted men and junior officers who lacked such support. The revelation added to the growing body of evidence about how the Vietnam War had been mismanaged at every level, from tactical decisions in the field to strategic planning in Washington. James's story became part of a larger narrative about institutional failure and the human cost of prioritizing image over integrity. Despite everything, James never regretted his service. He believed in the men he had fought beside, in the bond that formed between soldiers in combat. He had done his duty, had acted with courage when it mattered most, and no amount of bureaucratic betrayal could take that away from him. The medal he should have received was a symbol, important but not definitive of his worth or his actions. He had saved lives, and the men who were there knew it. That knowledge sustained him through the disappointments and frustrations, a private validation that didn't require official recognition. He was at peace with who he was, even if the system never fully acknowledged what he had done. In 2003, James Mitchell died of heart failure at the age of 59. His funeral was attended by family, friends, and a surprising number of veterans who had heard his story over the years. Men from his unit came to pay their respects, some traveling across the country to be there. They shared memories of the river ambush, of watching James stand exposed to enemy fire while giving them a chance to survive. They talked about the man he had been, brave and selfless, and how the system had failed to honor that. The local newspaper ran an obituary that mentioned his Distinguished Service Cross and his denied Medal of Honor, framing him as a hero who had been betrayed by bureaucracy. It was a fitting tribute, though it couldn't change the outcome of his story. Linda, his widow, spent the years after his death continuing to advocate for veterans who had been wrongly denied recognition. She worked with organizations that helped navigate the military awards process, using James's case as an example of what could go wrong and how to fight back. She gave interviews, wrote letters, and testified before congressional committees about the need for reform. Her efforts contributed to changes in how the military reviewed historical award recommendations, making it easier to correct past mistakes. It was slow work, frustrating and often discouraging, but she persisted because it was what James would have wanted. She kept his medals and commendations in a display case in her living room, a reminder of the man he had been and the recognition he should have received. The movement to posthumously award James the Medal of Honor gained momentum in the 2010s, driven by a new generation of veterans advocates and historians. They argued that the original decision had been so clearly tainted by political interference that it should be overturned, regardless of how much time had passed. They pointed to other cases where the military had corrected historical injustices, awarding medals decades after the fact to soldiers who had been overlooked or discriminated against. Why should James be any different? The case became a test of whether the military was truly committed to honoring its values or whether institutional inertia and the desire to avoid admitting past mistakes would prevail. In 2018, 50 years after the river ambush, Congress passed a special bill authorizing the president to award the Medal of Honor to James Mitchell posthumously. The bill acknowledged that political interference had prevented him from receiving the recognition he deserved in a timely manner, and that the extraordinary nature of his actions warranted the nation's highest military honor. It was a rare moment of bipartisan agreement, with lawmakers from both parties supporting the measure. The ceremony was held at the White House, with Linda and James's children in attendance. The current president draped the medal around a portrait of James in his uniform, young and serious. The man he had been before the war changed everything. It was a moment of triumph, but also of profound sadness. Justice had come, but it had taken half a century, and James wasn't there to receive it. The story of why James Mitchell's name was removed from a medal ceremony is ultimately about more than one man's fight for recognition. It's about how institutions can fail the people they're supposed to serve, how political connections can override merit and truth, and how the courage to stand up for what's right can be punished rather than rewarded. It's about a system that valued image over integrity, that protected the powerful at the expense of the deserving. But it's also about persistence, about people who refuse to let an injustice stand unchallenged, who fought for decades to set the record straight. James never got to wear his Medal of Honor, never got to hear his country officially acknowledge what he had done, but his story lived on, inspiring reforms and reminding people that the fight for justice is never truly over. His legacy is complicated. He was a hero who saved lives, a victim of political manipulation, and eventually a symbol of institutional failure and redemption. The medal that hangs in Linda's living room represents all of that, a tangible reminder that sometimes doing the right thing isn't enough, that you need people willing to fight for you long after you're gone. For younger veterans, his story is a warning about the system they serve and a call to demand better from the institutions that claim to honor sacrifice. For civilians, it's a reminder that military service involves more than battlefield courage, that the battles for recognition and justice can be just as difficult as combat itself. James Mitchell deserved better from his country, but in the end, his story became part of a larger conversation about what we owe the people who serve.